Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. My name is Dr. Brian Rade, and I'm a naturopathic doctor. And today I am joined by one of my patients. My patient's name is Gabrielle, and I've been working with her for a few years. And she has agreed to come on the podcast to talk about her experience. Primarily about using the Primal Trust system. Primal Trust, well, we'll get into the weeds of what that's all about, but in general, it's a system that can be really helpful for folks who are struggling with nervous system regulation. And a lot of folks with complex chronic health issues have nervous system dysregulation challenges. Many of my guests, for anyone who's listened to the podcast, you can attest to this. Many of my guests have talked about how nervous system regulation support is really important. And there are lots of different systems out there, or quite a few different systems, anyways. And Primal Trust is one that I've been just hearing more and more positive things about from from colleagues, and then I have a growing number of patients who are using the system and seeing benefits. Gabrielle's been using it, getting a lot of benefit from it, and again, we were chatting about it a couple of months ago. I asked if she wouldn't mind sharing her experiences, and she said she would. So we're going to have a good chat about it today. So, just before bringing her into the conversation, I'll just quickly mention that, as per usual, nothing that's said on on the podcast should be construed as medical advice. This is all for informational purposes only. And if you need medical advice, please talk to your healthcare provider to get that advice. And then I'll also mention that if you haven't if you're not already aware, I do have a Overcoming Chronic Illness course. If you sign up for my newsletter, the first two modules are available for no charge. And to sign up for the newsletter, you can go to the show notes if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, or if you're watching this on YouTube, then please just check the description below for the link to join the newsletter. With the newsletter, I send one out every maybe 1 to 3 months on average. It's not something that I'm sending out very often, so you won't be bombarded with emails from me. But I do send messages out or newsletters out just about upcoming podcast topics, things that I'm excited about in practice, different tests, various things, but just whatever's kind of comes to my brain whenever I have a minute to put a newsletter together. Please feel free to sign up for that if you are interested. So I'm going to pause the recording and I'll be back in just a moment. All right, everyone. I am now joined by my patient, Gabrielle. Gabrielle, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's great to be here and really fun to be here with you in this way after being a patient for 3 years.
It's a different dynamic today, but we always have good chats, so I'm sure today will be no exception. Um,
Absolutely.
well, just before we start chatting about primal trust and other nervous system regulating things, would you mind just giving folks a little background about your health journey, please?
Happy to. I mean, I think it was great when I started with you in 2021 and learned the term complex chronic illness because it helped illuminate for me much of my a direction of travel in my life. And I'm one of your sensitive patients, and thankfully you're willing to work with us.
Happy to do
I'm
it.
sure that's its own commitment. And I think for me, some people's story of complex chronic illness is something that happened overnight. There was a tick bite, and then the next day they felt terrible, and that went into whatever version of a journey or a virus or something like that. And for me, it really was a slow unfolding. This sort of the metaphor of the frog that's heated up in water and they can't quite tell. And that's really my story, until I hit the perfect storm that brought that chronic illness fully in a way that I could no longer ignore. And so, I was always a very sensitive child. My mom tells stories about how I couldn't handle formula or cow's milk when she went back to work. She went back to work when I was quite young, and I had allergies growing up, and certainly food sensitivities as a teenager. And I was also, emotionally attuned to the world and people around me in many ways. And it was in my late 20s that, the food sensitivity started to ramp up in the sense that, it wasn't just avoiding one thing. It was, oh, now I need to avoid this. Oh, and then this food sensitivity creeped in, and and then a fatigue really set in deeply that I couldn't shake. But I still didn't know it wasn't normal, at that point. I started a PhD at that time. I traveled a lot for work, but it really was my mid-30s when I realized that my health was compromising my ability to function substantially. That was sort of when I thought, oh, something is really off here. And so, that looked like at that time, going to work, but then spending weekends and evenings in bed, trying to distract myself from how I felt. And that was around the time that I started seeing doctors and specialists and uh, naturopaths for the first time. And a shout out to Dr. Sandra Murphy, who was my first naturopath, who really helped open huge doorways for me. I came to you through that, which, I mean, you have been such a fundamental part of supporting me in recovery. And that's a pretty incredible place to speak from, that I feel like I am in recovery. And so just to give listeners a sense of what my symptoms were like when they were at my worst, migraines and vomiting, just deep, unshakable fatigue, this feeling of constantly being hungover, like I had gone on a big bender, but I was only drinking water, down to 5 safe foods I could eat, skin issues, redness, itchiness, bloating, cold and flu-like symptoms, sore throat a lot of the time, bladder pain, insomnia, ringing in my ears, multiple chemical sensitivities, and then ongoing anxiety on top of that, right? Because not only were these here, but they were getting worse, slowly and consistently and methodically getting worse. And so, within this sort of decade, I would say of this big journey, at least 3 of those years were so bad I really was 95% bedbound, homebound, was on medical leave from work, and really, quite frankly, unsure if I would ever be able to go back. And that was also a question that was so far from anything I cared about. I was just in the suffering of it. So, and I think when I came to you first in 2021, as I know is the case with many of your patients, it's hard to start treatments when you're so sensitive to every treatment or herbal support or supplement. And so certainly for me to understand that I was in some kind of mast cell activation, histamine issues, was really helpful to frame that. So that was certainly the big part of the journey. And then I would say, the big milestones in my recovery was one, starting to work with you and getting to some of the root issues for me. And in particular, I would say my main root cause, at least as I understand it now, really is environmental sensitivities, and in particular mold. And so there have been treatments, and then it has really been Primal Trust and brain retraining work that has really helped and bring me to a next level of wellness. But the rocky road of how to get there has certainly been a puzzle to put together. And for me, a part of that, and we can get into this too, is, I know many people can heal from things like mold sensitivity while still living in mold. I've heard many of those stories. And I think for me, my sensitivity was so high that actually a part of my nervous system reset was changing location, both in terms of where I worked, my office space, and my home space. So, and I feel like that's actually quite connected to the nervous system work in many ways that I now understand in hindsight.
Well, that's a great summary, Gabrielle, and I'm so glad that you're doing so much better now and that you're, in the recovery phase of things. And I'd say well along your way in the recovery phase. That's awesome. Just before we kind of get a bit more into the primal trust aspect of things, I'm just wondering, when you're telling your story there, the truncated version, because it's a long story. It's hard to summarize a lifetime into 5 minutes there. But you just mentioned that when you were, I'm paraphrasing here, but that you're kind of at some points kind of like distracting yourself with anyways, I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that. And I just feel like there's probably something there that would be valuable for folks. Like what were, if you don't mind maybe just saying like, in what way were you distracting yourself? And maybe with, good old 2020 hindsight, like why were you distracting yourself?
Great, great question. So for me at the time, it looked like reading books in worlds, in fictional worlds. They couldn't be, they couldn't be too close to my own reality. Definitely watched a lot of Netflix at that time. I got into phone games, and it really literally was anything that took me away from having to think about my body. And that would happen in my off time when I was at work. I mean, up until the point where I couldn't work anymore. But there were a few years where I kept going. And but when I was at work, there was something about the having purpose. I think as well, I'm a professor, so teaching in the classroom, I would probably have adrenaline and cortisol rushing through my body, and that actually helped me feel good because I didn't feel symptomatic when I was in these kind of highly performative states where a lot was required of me. It would kind of overcome, my body would overcome its set point of feeling what was happening. And so I think for at least 3 to 4 years, I would feel not great at work, but not fixated on what was happening in my body at work. And then I would get home and I would crash. And I just physically couldn't do much and really needed to distract myself fully. And so now I do understand that as, you know, connected to nervous system regulation, that I was actually in a chronic stress state of fight or flight that was happening in my body because of exposures, because of what my limbic system had decided was dangerous and was trying to protect me. And so I would go into these shutdowns and then these super activation stages. And that was about 3 to 4 years, I would say, of this journey before I actually just had the complete crash where my body fully shut down on me. Yeah.
It's amazing when you throw out the timelines of like, years of doing these things, and it really speaks to the resiliency of, the human spirit and physiology and all of that. But yeah, it's quite an adaptive mechanism. Um,
Yeah.
so, Gabrielle, I'd like to, just kind of ask you some questions about amygdala retraining, in part because, if memory serves, you had been doing amygdala retraining before we started working together a few years ago. And then, Primal Trust maybe in the last year or so,
About, yeah.
give or take. But would you mind just describing for listeners what, amygdala retraining is versus, describe Primal Trust. I don't know. It's so
Yeah.
many things
Yeah.
rolled into one, but could you give a little background on those, please?
Yeah. Happy to. And maybe I'll talk about what they each are first and then my experiences with them.
Great.
So Primal Trust is in the body of work that often would be considered a brain retraining program. And it is, but it's plus plus. So it is a way to consciously learn to self-regulate the body and the biology to support healing from chronic illness. Although I think it would just be useful for every human being on the planet today, is how I see it. And so Primal Trust has a number of elements to it: brain retraining, nervous system regulation, somatic or body-based practices, vagus nerve toning work, and then also, uh, a secondary level, which is around self-discovery, which is very much about when you start to feel better through this approach, how do you shift your life's purpose from being about recovering from illness to having a greater purpose and orientation in life? And that is a very hard and challenging shift to make, but I think in my own experience, essential to that next step of recovery and healing and wellness. And there are a number of these kinds of training programs out there, although the other ones tend to be slightly more contained, we would say. So focusing on just one of those things or two of those things. So brain retraining, for instance, which is working with the amygdala and the limbic system, which is for listeners, it's part of our autonomic nervous system, but it's brain centric. And so the amygdala being the region of the brain that decides what's dangerous and then sends messages to the rest of the body. And so really these kinds of programs, these brain retraining programs, are not about saying, oh, it's all in your head, which I think initially I was curious about and also resistant to, because that can be sometimes the messaging folks get in the medical system. Well, your labs are showing up normal, so let's put you on an SSRI and maybe see a therapist. And what I've understood actually is that it is a brain injury. It's not a mind injury, although there are thoughts and anxieties and pieces that are connected to it. But for some people, in these types of chronic illness contexts and complex chronic illness, it really can be a form of the limbic system being impaired, where the limbic system is just triggered for all kinds of reasons. And I can see now, looking back over my life, that progression, and that I was sensitive to it from the beginning. So the programs have different focuses, and I think what I like, so when I did one of the other brain retraining programs before I came to you, I found that it really helped me at that time feel emotionally better. I felt more emotionally regulated. I did the program for about 8 months. I saw some shift in symptoms initially, but then many of them came back. And so it wasn't quite right for me as the journey out of my chronic illness, although it certainly helped me in many ways understand and work with my anxiety and work with the parts of me that were fearful. So what I love about Primal Trust, which is founded by Dr. Kathleen King, and I'm a fan, but I'm not sponsoring, there's no connection or affiliation yet, I
Oh, no
say,
worries.
but more so that I think when I say yet, it just feels like I want to be connected to this community over time in significant ways. But as I mentioned, it's a way to consciously learn to self-regulate the body. And I think the biggest piece is the brain and the body, is to how to send messages of safety to the nervous system so that it can heal. And we know that from research, lots of research, that when the body moves from the sympathetic into the parasympathetic state, that's the rest and the digest and the heal. And as I've learned, being in a chronic stress response, for me, it was environmental related. It was also, impacted by lifestyle choices, all of those kinds, or lifestyle conditions, I should say, not choices, conditions, had led to this impairment, right? So it's about how we learn to send these messages of safety. And what is great about Primal Trust is that it's brain or top down as well as body up. And that's been really valuable for me. So some of the practices, that are a really big part of it are breathing practices, functional neuropathy, which is brain recovery, eye exercises, a lot of safe enough movement for the body, and how to figure out how you do that. I was very frightened to move because I would get quite symptomatic. I mean, I remember, it's like 10 seconds on a rebounder and I would be in bed for 2 days. Movement was scary. I mean, everything was scary to my body. And I think And so this is why it's really made sense to me, and the commitment to start this program again. And I would say one of the other factors for me that really meant I didn't progress as far in the first program that I did was because I was still living in a home that had quite a high mold count, and I was working in an office that was water damaged, significantly worse than my home. So the two places that I was going to, my limbic system, my nervous system had no break. So that chronic stress response was just amping up and amping up and amping up. And so for me, I mean, it got so bad that there were no other options left, and I wasn't able to do any of the treatments, and and so for me actually moving, and I know that this is beyond a lot of people's capacity. There's a ton of things you can do in your home to make it possible, but for me, I was so sensitive and in such terrible shape. I did feel like I was dying. That there was no other option. And I feel like when I removed myself from my office context and moved spaces, that it actually gave my nervous system an opportunity to reset in a way that it hadn't had. But what was also interesting about moving into a new space where I had air filters going and a dehumidifier and all of these things, and I started to really understand how environment was impacting me, I started to become more and more fearful. And I started to become more sensitive to spaces outside of my own that before had been fine. So I actually had a real ramp up of, maybe I shouldn't say sensitivity. The sensitivity button was already turned on, the light switch, but the reactivity started to really increase. And so as a part of this Primal Trust process for me, it really has been about helping to rein my system back in around what it's fearful of, what it finds scary and unsafe.
Just as far as and I remember you mentioned that when we spoke recently about, when you got out of the moldy home and, were taking a leave of absence from work, so not in the water damaged office, that you became more, reactive to other environments. And I guess I'm just wondering in that regard, like, did it seem like it, in hindsight, as you reflected on this, did it seem like it was more of a, sorry, I can't think of a better word off the top of my head, but did it seem like it was more of a fear-induced reactivity, or do you feel like you were, that it was maybe coming from more of a physical state where your body was like, oh, like I'm finally getting a break from this mold, and then if I am in a place that's water damaged, like by golly, like, I never want to go back there. So the body was kind of like overreacting, so to speak, to say like, no, Gabrielle, like stay the heck out of that environment. Like, do you have a sense of how much of it was coming from more of an emotional place versus physical place?
I would say at first it was very physical. Uh, it was just my body being like, yep, no, you figured something out here for us, and it is unsafe to do any of these things. And so really for a year and a half, I did not go inside other buildings of any kind. And I think that was an important part. I do think as I started to feel better, and this was around the time when I was able to start doing more of the treatments that you and I were working on. So my body was starting to sort of say, okay, we have enough distance from that ongoing stressor that we can try other things, and not everything. I mean, there were still things that I was reactive to, but I was less reactive, and I was able to start to take things and do treatments and so forth. But I do think towards the end of this period, and I don't think we can separate them, that the anxiety, that the body generates anxiety because something is harmful. And so part of it now has been letting my body know you actually are safe. You actually have a clean environment. You don't ever have to go into that office again. Can we, from that place, walk into the grocery store for 5 minutes and not have a reaction? Because I'm not going to keep you there for very long. Like that. and it sounds like I'm having a dialogue with my body, but that is part of it. I mean, there are different ways to access the nervous system, but part of it is actually almost parenting yourself, and not to convince that part to do something that it isn't okay with, but to be in a collaborative relationship with the body as it tries to move out into the world again. And I certainly think my anxiety ratcheted up in huge ways. And so the limbic system then starts to scan for any kind of threat. And so anything can be threatening, you know, and I was really struck by when I started Primal Trust, and actually at the same time I had started the neurofeedback with you, my body decided neurofeedback was dangerous. And I had pretty strong reactions to it. And what was so fascinating to me, and now, you know, 6 months later, after having done a lot, taking a break from neurofeedback, because I just couldn't handle it anymore. I couldn't handle the recovery time I needed. When I did, then I kept working on Primal Trust over that time. And then I came back this summer and, you know, can't tell at all that there's been any impact on my body from the neurofeedback. But what I found really interesting was just noticing how my body's reactivity was increasing around all things, because what it was learning to do in general was to fear things and to be suspicious. And so, and understandably, for very good reason, you know, and so that, to answer your question, it's both.
Um, so to take all the complexity, or like to really kind of distill it down, and I'm not doing it justice here, but I'm getting the sense that it's with the Primal Trust method, it's kind of about creating this internal sense of safety, and then from there kind of maybe having some like progressively more exposures to things that aren't necessarily safe, and seeing how your body's tolerating that. And if you go a little too fast, then it's like, okay, let's go back, let's do these self-regulating exercises, and then kind of build up more of a tolerance to things. Is there some semblance of truth to what I said, or am I missing the mark?
Absolutely. That's not where you start, though. Of course, where you start is actually just letting your body, your nervous system untangle itself without timelines or pressure. And so, you know, early on, how that starts in the program is you do a lot of intentional mood elevation, you know, to just help that, like, I mean, gosh, when I learned that complex chronic illness is a form of PTSD, and you know, or ongoing trauma, you know, it makes sense because that's what the internal feeling is like. So there's intentional mood elevation practices, these ways of getting the neuroplasticity to just imagine being well, which for a sick person is painful, painful, painful. So how do you ease into that practice? How do you ease into accessing memories, if you can, from when you were younger, where you felt some ease in your body? These kinds of things, the functional neuropathy, the eye movement work, a lot of vagus nerve practices of physical sounds, you know, so getting the vocal cords going, breath practices. There isn't meditation, and there isn't, which is so interesting to me, because I was a meditation practitioner for a decade. And sometimes I would sit for an hour a day and I would finish a session and go, why do I feel worse than when I started? And I now understand, oh, well, my nervous system was dysregulated. So what I was being present with was a dysregulated nervous system. And so
Not the best
that,
company.
no, not the best. It's definitely not for an hour to start your day. Definitely not. And I know meditation and mindfulness can be powerful and transformative for many people, but I think in a chronic illness context, for me, I realized it wasn't the right thing for me. It was too much. And I actually just needed to calm the nervous system down. So in Primal Trust, you really do start with these foundational practices of calming the nervous system down. So you just even know what that feels like. And you and I were talking about this last week as well. From polyvagal theory, there is this idea of the polyvagal wave, and the vagus nerve is connected. It's part of our autonomic nervous system, and it's really what kicks in our rest and digest, our parasympathetic response. And so vagus nerve toning is a big part of this program, which I think is what sets it apart. Actually, it's one of the really great things that I've found so valuable. But what's also helpful in Primal Trust is they talk about this polyvagal wave, or climbing the polyvagal ladder, that to actually get to a place of rest and digest and safety and connection, if you have been living in a chronic illness state for months or years or decades, you're actually in a shutdown. You're not really even in fight or flight anymore. You're in freeze. You're just in, maybe some of us are in functional freeze and still going to work, but spending the evenings or weekends in bed, or we're in complete shutdown, right? The bodies just cannot handle that stress load anymore. But to actually move to that place of safety and rest, and a regulated nervous system, we actually have to move through a sympathetic response as the nervous system unravels and untangles. And I needed to know that, because I actually went through a phase in Primal Trust where I got a lot worse, where symptoms came back that I hadn't seen for years. And it did feel like this untangling or unraveling, but to recognize that there's actually a sympathetic response that happens in the body, that fight or flight, as we move through. So even just that framing is really helpful. There's no way out but through.
I'm glad you brought up the ANS ladder, autonomic nervous system ladder, because it was on my list here, and I appreciate you pausing there, because I have a perfect or a question I'm very curious about. So, and just that concept is like, when I first heard that some time ago, it was like, wow, it just kind of blew my mind. It's like, oh, that makes so much sense when folks are in that, freeze mode, that, dorsal vagal state. It's like, of course you have to go through sympathetic to get to the ventral vagal. Of course, like, just makes so much sense. Good old 2020 hindsight. I'm just wondering, just for folks listening, because I think it would be helpful if you don't mind sharing, like, what were some of those symptoms that came back, like, as you were kind of like unraveling, as you said, like, kind of moving from the dorsal vagal shutdown state into, towards that ventral vagal, regulated state. What were some of those symptoms that came up, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I mean, headaches were a big one, which to me, I actually think it was likely some detoxification happening. I think headache is, for me, that a really big indicator of the difference between reactivity and say a healing crisis. But my insomnia came back, that kind of feeling of my body processing things at night. I noticed I had really high anxiety levels. Like, my baseline emotional and physical state was just, I just felt like I was on caffeine all of the time, and it was a good, I hate to say it, but it was a good 60 days for me, where it was quite heightened. It was manageable. It wasn't like when I had taken a supplement and I had this kind of very extreme, my body was like, no. I was still functional, but it was like the headaches, the bladder pain, this kind of constant UTI feeling, like just some of my classic symptoms that came back and were just hanging around. But they also came as a cluster, and usually they'd sort of ebb and flow. If I think back to before, it would be like, sometimes this symptom would be more dominant, sometimes that symptom, but they kind of all came back in a cluster. And from what I understand with this sort of moving through that, not feeling worse before you feel better, that there are a number of reasons. One can just be the energy shift that's happening in the body when you kind of unlock that dorsal vagal shutdown. So there's just like an energy rush. Maybe I don't know if it's the mitochondria and the ATP that start. So that can be uncomfortable. There can be this healing crisis or detox process that can happen. There can just be from moving from that disconnected, frozen state through into a different emotional state, just ramped up anxiety and worry and rumination and, all of those things that require moving through. And, and I hadn't had that framing in that way in the previous system that I did. And so it was really helpful for me to know as it was happening, oh yeah, this is different. This is different. And part of the way to sort of sense that is even if you're feeling symptomatic in this phase of the unraveling of your nervous system, are you within that also able to access even just occasionally a feeling of safety in the body? And I was, because I was really bringing so much intention to the practices and to understanding the process. And so that sort of coaching of the self, okay, you can stay with this. Let's see what happens. Let's be curious about it.
I have a couple of follow questions to that, Gabrielle. So just in terms of like, the 60 days of sympathetic roller coastering, is that average timeline for getting through that phase? Is that on the longer end? Do you have a sense from other do you have a sense of
Yeah.
how that fits
I
with
think
other
it
folks?
really yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the person. There are people who come into Primal Trust, and again, I remember this from the previous program that I did, who within 4 to 5 months are 100% better.
Hmm.
And I have noticed that they tend to be the people in particular. If you can imagine, I am jealous of the people who have long COVID because it's happened more recently.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so their body has less backed up years to move through. So I actually feel like people who catch, say, an infection really quickly, or the people who are like, 2 years ago, overnight, something happened and I just felt terrible. And I started looking for answers and it took me so long. But 2 months later, I found this nervous system training program. And I'm so glad I did, because it was just excruciating for that, 6 month period. But now I've been doing it for 4 months and I'm great. Um, I think it really depends. You know, and so my story in many ways is one that's longer. And yet at the same time, I can't believe the acceleration that has happened in my recovery over the past 10 months that I've been doing this program regularly. So that unraveling of the nervous system, I think, you can back off the intensity at which you're doing the tools. But it's also important for reactive people to not back off so completely and utterly that then your body decides, and yes, primal trust is dangerous. Like there is something about, okay, yeah, you back off this. If you are having a detox reaction or whatever it is, but Brian, it blew my mind that I wasn't taking anything. I wasn't going out into buildings and spaces. I wasn't having stressful conversations in my life or in a work environment. I was doing nothing but nervous system work, and my body was freaking out. Which, when that happened, it's like, oh, oh, there's something here. This part of me doesn't want to be seen, because it would rather, it's protective when it's constantly pointing the finger in other directions. And those directions, again, are valid. I never want to live in mold again. I don't think I should get to a place where I can just hack that, no problem, but there is something about the nervous system doesn't like the attention. The light shone on it. And I feel like perhaps that was part of what was happening with neurofeedback as well.
So I'm just wondering, like, if you, I don't know, not if you had a do-over, but if say there was, I don't know, another version of you, Gabrielle, who was like, okay, if I'm not going to do this for 60 days, like I need an easier go of things. I will say, we'll say a less resilient version of yourself. Um, if do you think that if you had pulled back on some of the exercises that it would have been just maybe a longer than 60 days, but a less stress, maybe a less intense 60 days, or maybe you would have had more like periods of not having as much sympathetic activation? Like, do you have
Hmm.
any speculation on that?
Well, I did pull back. I did have to pull back. I would say that it wasn't consistently intense for those 60 days. It was just noticeable to me because I had pockets of being symptom free just by the work that you and I were doing together up until that point. So, yeah, I think you can start low and slow. And I think for any reactive person out there, that's the most important thing. And oftentimes, and I know for me, I've always like wanted to push it. And when I did Primal Trust, I really made a commitment to myself to not do it, to not push. And so that was me not pushing through. And maybe that was why I don't know why that it was 60 days. A good friend of mine was doing it at the same time. She had a much shorter period initially, I would say, or we weren't quite the same, but her body responded in different ways too, and has had to pull back, at different points along in the program. And I would just say like low and slow with everything, with supplements, with brain retraining, with neurofeedback, with, I mean, and it just like bringing this home to, a new treatment that you and I are trying for me is the jar sits out on the kitchen table beside my plate for weeks before I open it. And I just have it there. Like, and this maybe sounds extreme to some people listening. I don't know. But when you have a reactive limbic system, even the smell of something or the look of something can create that cascade in the body. And so it's like, I let the supplement sit out on the table and then I'll pick the bottle up, after a week or two, and just then I'll open the lid and then I'll touch it in my hand and then I'll have it sitting out in an open container. Like I really, um, after so many years of pushing and then having to pull back completely and it's like this is a long game for me at this point for all things. And so if anybody is listening to this who decides they want to try a program like Primal Trust as part of their healing and their recovery, do not push it. Just really use it as an opportunity to trust your body over what your mind your mind thinks needs to happen. And I think the hardest part of that, I mean, I was obsessed with when I first came to you. I don't know if you remember this, but at the end of every appointment, I'd say, tell me success stories.
I remember
Tell
that.
like,
Yep.
right? Tell me success stories. And I would listen to testimonials of all kinds of things. And now I actually realize that was pretty helpful because it was this way of positively orienting towards the future when my body couldn't access that. But at the same time, I didn't believe it could happen for me. And so sometimes that would need me to push or be hard on myself to recover. And now I think if I look back, if I could wisely say to myself, there is a way out of this, you will get there. You will feel more vitality and more connectedness to the people around you, the place that you live, the work that you do. Just go low and slow and steady, that there's no timeline. That is the wisdom that I wish I could take back to that previous self. But it was very hard to access because it's a crisis place. It's a place of desperation.
Well, I think it's really useful to tell folks that are listening to this interview, Gabrielle. So can't tell yourself in the past, but at least you're telling people now. So much
Yeah.
appreciated for that. Um, I have a bunch of other questions for you, Gabrielle, but I know we don't have an infinite amount of time left. But maybe one of the things I want to ask you about is just as you're talking about all of this, like, some of the things with the Primal Trust system, and, I really appreciate emphasizing how, and I very much appreciate about the Primal Trust system that there is, as you said, kind of that top down and bottom up approach. I think that's, yeah, part of the magic of Primal Trust as well. I'm just wondering, like, with all of this, like, I can't imagine that either as part of the Primal Trust system, or what would just kind of come up as part of this would be some type of, mental emotional processing work. So you kind of mentioned, doing, breath work and various things like that, vagus nerve stimulating exercises and whatnot. I'm just wondering, is part of the Primal Trust system, does it involve like kind of getting into psychoanalysis, looking at analyzing things from your childhood, all these lovely, lovely, sometimes very uncomfortable things, or do things just kind of like naturally percolate up to the surface and it's just like, oh yeah, I'm just kind of over that thing that happened in high school that I think about all the time that I just never really, that or this traumatic thing that happened. Like, I'm just wondering if you could maybe speak to that side of things a
Mm,
little bit, please.
yeah, well, the Primal Trust has three levels. The first level is regulate, which is all about what we've been talking about. And then there's a next level, which is a mentorship, which is really looking at these pieces together and with good support. But the caveat really is, don't go there until you found some balance in your nervous system. So really in that regulate, there's a great image that Dr. Kat shows, which is, it's a red circle and it has stress written inside of it. And there's two of them side by side, same circle, both with the word stress in it. And then there's this blue circle or this blue ring around it on one side. And it sort of shows your nervous system capacity to self-regulate. And it's quite thin. So the stress, the stress circle looks much bigger than the blue regulation ring around it. And what you want to be doing in level one is growing that blue ring so that your ability to regulate the stress level probably in your life maybe hasn't changed, although in my case with environmental stressors it did, but just being a human being and what it means to live life, and to just say that I really was aware that my anxiety was quite intense, because I would go, why is this small stressor creating a 10 in my body? A 10 out of 10 reaction in my body. And that was just from that chronic stress response. So this first level is building that nervous system capacity to hold that stress. And this is one of the reasons why, which makes sense to me, like why you wouldn't meditate when your body is dysregulated, right? Because that's can be quite a reflective, introspective thing, especially if you're not doing any kind of regulated breathing. You're just sort of being with what is, but then you're being with a dysregulated nervous system, which is, as we talked about, no fun. And likewise, therapeutic approaches that are bringing up or engaging trauma, little small t trauma to huge big T trauma, and you're in a dysregulated state, there's nowhere for it to go. There's nowhere to process it. So it can actually just continue to trigger the limbic system. And perhaps, and I think there are many people who have great experiences of moving through things, but in this Primal Trust work, and really feels true to me that you wouldn't engage in that work until you have a level of stability. And then once you get there, there are very intentional ways to go about it. And so first of all, I think I mentioned at the beginning, one of them is to start shifting from a fix-it mentality around health to who do I want to be and what do I want to contribute when I'm well or as I'm well? What is my purpose that is greater than not being sick? And as I mentioned, was a painful transition because my world just became all about that. How do I get better? And so from that place, you do start to do what are working with the parts of you that might be the parts of you. For me, one of the ones is the achiever part of me that will push through the pacing that my body needs and will probably need for the rest of my life. I have to be in a very big renovation around a part of me that functioned very well to get me to a certain level of success in my life. She can't do that anymore in that way, and she will throw temper tantrums about it. And this is internal family systems work and parts therapy, like to work with and build a relationship with that, and so Dr. Kat talks about that as growing the adult main personality, who's actually sailing this ship here. And so there can be all kinds of parts that are part of that have felt like they've needed to do caretaking for us for all kinds of reasons. And I was skeptical about this at first, but Dr. Kat was saying, you can regulate till the cows come home. But if you don't do this deeper work, you'll never actually kind of move out of that cycle of having a stressor, needing to regulate, and learning to do that really well. But it has been since doing the level 2 mentorship that I have noticed some very significant shifts where I can actually catch things in a totally, totally different way. But it's not scary. It's like, as you described, it's like you just sort of like let things bubble up, but you don't go looking like what in my childhood was terrible. It's more like, what happened today that I resisted or judged or felt in my body a reaction? And understanding that, what part might that be connected to? What are the storylines that are attached to that? Are they true? How can I pull apart the storyline, but I'll let the feeling just still be there in my body, or the symptom be there in my body? So there is there are really powerful practices. And I think I know she's coming on the podcast later, but she talks about how she actually developed the level 2 mentorship first because she was doing these other brain retraining programs and went, okay, these are good foundations, but I feel like there's actually this other piece that needs attention. And so she actually launched her work first with level 2, but then over time realized she needed to add her own kind of basic nervous system brain retraining course to go with it. So I certainly think that they're paired and important in many ways.
It sounds like they really are. And as you said, excuse me, the start of the interview, this is probably something that every person should probably do because, man, I'm thinking like, no, I should probably do this primal trust as well, as much as I have, worked on myself over the years as well. But yeah, that sounds really awesome, Gabrielle. I'm just wondering, like, as far as the part 2 mentorship goes, what kind of clinicians are you working with? Like, what are their just yeah. Anyways, yeah, what kind of clinicians
Yeah.
or mentors? What are their backgrounds, I guess, or whatnot?
Well, the term mentorship might give you a sense, which is there are a lot of disclaimers. So you're not working with any trained clinicians in the field of therapy or
Okay.
I so Kathleen, Dr. Kat brings in those pieces from internal family systems and parts work and provides ways and exercises for people to do that work on their own. But again, as I mentioned, you're not doing deep dives into the darkest parts of your psyche, although if and when they come up, which they inevitably do, you have these tools for working with them. And so sometimes it is as simple as, how do you bring an internal dialogue of two parts of you that are in tension around something? One part wants to do something and the other doesn't. How do you just say have a guided journaling process or a meditation or just bringing awareness and attention to things. So there are not registered therapists who are guiding this part of the practice. And I come from a background as well. I'm an academic, and so certifications are important to me, and how we regulate fields and credentials, as you're nodding here. And so, but I certainly feel now, having gone through level 2, that it is actually a way to empower people to have access to very simple tools and processes that are a human birthright and should be accessible to everyone. And it is different than therapy, and still have a therapist and go and do that work with them.
That all sounds really good to me, Gabrielle. And just to clarify, because I'm just not 100% clear, and so just want to make sure we're clear for the audience too. So are there, but you're actually working with someone, like it's the mentorship, or is it more like, are you like interfacing
Oh,
one-on-one
great.
or in a group setting in some way, or can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, so all of Primal Trust, all of the levels are self-paced. You can do it all self-paced with pre-recorded, both from Regulate through the mentorship. So you can watch lectures or live classes that have been recorded. You can sign up for one-on-one coaching if you'd like to do that. There are also peer coaching groups so that don't have any kind of Primal Trust staff person or guide with you, but you've been connected through the platform to be in conversation together as you move through the material. And you can join live Zoom. So one of the great things about the community is this sort of self-paced content, but then throughout the week, there are plenty of Zoom calls and classes and opportunities to connect in with others doing the practice or be guided through practices. So yeah, lots of options.
Okay, awesome. And then just pragmatically for folks who are listening, what's the time commitment been like for you doing the Primal Trust work? I know it's been a journey, but just ballpark,
Mhm.
what's the time commitment?
I think for the initial, that initial, I would say 6 months when I was in the basic regulation program, uh, it's not an immediate 1 hour a day, but there are at a certain point as you start to fill up the toolkit, about an hour and a half, and that seems like a lot. But at that point in time, it was worth it to me, and so it was broken up throughout the day. And now, I'm 8 months in. And so some days I do 10 minutes in the morning before I get going, and then do things throughout the day, like a breath practice here or there, or a visualization, or even just a quick interrupting. It's called a pattern interrupt of any kind of anxious thoughts that I'm having around fixating on my body or symptoms. Um, but I do think that to really get over the hump, there is a period of time where you do want to be committing to an hour and a half a day if you can, and have that be broken up throughout the day. Because again, that's just a way to continually train the nervous system to come back to regulation, which um, I really needed. And I understand why that's kind of part of the program. But as you graduate on, then you get to pick and choose what are the tools that you need. And I would certainly say for me at this point, it is a lifestyle practice that I will have for the rest of my life in some way.
And just maybe a little follow-up question to that. I'm just thinking I have thinking of one patient in particular who was doing an amygdala retraining program, and she found that it was like just literally too much physically. Like there was literally like needing to walk in a circle
Mm.
to do part of this, and so. And I think eventually she was doing it like sitting in a chair, but I'm just wondering, is with the Primal Trust, is there any need for physical resiliency? Like, could you do it lying in bed? Like, do you have to be sitting up? Do you have to be moving? Are there physical limitations that might get in the way of someone doing the program?
You can do it in bed, and Dr. Kat tells her story about how she was, laying in a dark room for years, unable to handle light, sound, anything like that. And she just started with 20 seconds twice a day, of, I think it was the eye movement exercises. And so wherever you're at, there are adaptations and modifications. And even if, part of the program is like, you do need to move in some way if you can, to start to shift up the energy that might be starting to be released as you untangle the nervous system. But that could be as simple as laying in bed and doing squeezing your muscles, or lifting your arm, just starting to teach your body in small ways. This movement is safe, lifting the arm, stretching. I have a good friend of mine who is uh, likely has long COVID and is severely ill, severely bedbound, can only handle sound for 60 seconds at a time. And she's been working with a ton of practitioners. This is in Ontario, and she's doing Primal Trust. I passed it along to her parents, and they're going through the program, and they're consolidating it, and they're teaching it to her in 60 minutes, 60-second segments, where they're speaking really slowly and then resting. And she is going, so, the lowest and slowest you possibly can. And I can't report back yet how that's going, but I would just say there's all kinds of modifications to do, and people show up in all degrees along that spectrum of how severely chronically ill they are, you know? And it's quite remarkable to me that even when I think about my worst, which is horrific to think about, is still not the worst that other people experience.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the extra info there because that was kind of segueing into my next question of like I've had other patients where like they're really electromagnetically sensitive and they can't go on a computer at all. So that would be a barrier. And hopefully folks, if they have those limitations, they'll have folks in their lives like the parents of the person you mentioned who can help them out along the way because it's all online, right? Like there's probably
Yeah.
no print option or whatnot. So I guess and then in terms of the content, is it mostly is it a mix of like video and written content, or what's the primary medium?
The primary medium for the lessons is video, with slide decks and lots of information. So I could imagine that would be and could be very overwhelming for some people, not just being in front of a screen for that long, but also just the vast quantities of the scientific framing of why this makes sense. And that is part of the treatment in some way, is understanding what's going on. But I think for different people on that, wherever they are, that could be a lot. So it's video. There are printed workbooks that go with each module that you can print out at home, but there's certainly not, you couldn't just look at that workbook and get everything you need. They really are there. But, there have been times where I don't feel like watching the video and I can listen, obviously plug in my headphones. I'm not a Bluetooth headphone person, of course, and just listen to the content or revisit it that way. So, and there might be ways that people, for instance, don't know if there are other ways that they can listen to things safely, but, whatever, downloading those videos or screen recording them and turning them into some other kind of format. I think even just audio would work for people.
That's great. Well, Gabrielle, I know we're winding down on time here, and I really appreciate all the info. I think you've answered all the questions that I could think of for the most part. I'm just wondering, is there anything else that comes to mind that you want to share about, your experience with Primal Trust or anything? Any questions I should have asked that I didn't ask that you think would be useful for folks? I feel like we covered a lot of ground, so no pressure, but anything that springs to mind?
Nothing in particular, but just, I think just leaving the conversation on an optimistic note. And I think, I mean, I love that you just wanted to talk to me about Primal Trust, because of course I'm thinking, well, Brian, you could ask me about the myriad of things that we did together that really helped me too, And so I just want to say that it isn't one or the other. And that there are some brain retraining programs out there that will say that you don't need anything else to get better. And Primal Trust isn't one of those. And like sometimes it's better to set other things aside and just focus on this nervous system regulation for 6 months to a year if you can, rather than trying to go down all of the other rabbit holes of trying things that your body's rejecting. But but I just want to sort of say how appreciative I am of you and your clinic and the incredible treatments you offer and the care and the curiosity and the walking alongside and your unfailing optimism in this, which, I often think to myself, wow, I wonder how you do it. I wonder how you handle stories like mine over and over again, and I just see you with this kind of unfailing positivity about what's possible and how significant and how important that is for people like me when we come into an office after oftentimes seeing so many practitioners that say, I'm sorry, I don't know, I can't help you, your blood works normal, you're just going to have to learn to live with this. So just want to say thank you to that, and a plug for you and your clinic and this incredible community you're building through all of your generous offerings of podcasts and Instagrams and YouTubes, and it's just incredible. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Gabrielle. It's very, very kind, and it really means a lot to hear you say that. And I'm, yeah, happy I've been able to help you, and really appreciate all that. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today and share your story. And I think this is going to be really helpful for a lot of folks, because I think that folks hear about kind of the nervous system regulation piece, and as you said, like there's just certain yes, just certain barriers to, I think, folks maybe taking that step. But I've had patients, dovetailing on what you just said, where it's like, you know what, we've been trying this and this and this, and like it's just the writing on the wall is like your limbic system is just rejecting all this stuff. It's not that you're like you react to everything under the planet. It's, well, you or under the sun, you do, and it's not because you just happen to react to every supplement. It's like, no, there's a common thread here, and it's your limbic system, it's your nervous system. And so I'll say, hey, like let's hit the pause button on this, do some nervous system regulation work, then let's start revisiting things. And as you can attest to, like certain things that your body was like, no way am I ever going to take this. Like eventually you can take it, because
Yeah.
that wasn't the problem. You had to do that internal work. So yeah, so I really appreciate you talking about this, because I think it's going to be really helpful for folks, make it more accessible for people to consider it for themselves if it seems like the right fit. Just before we wrap things up here, Gabrielle, I know before we started recording, I mentioned that at the end of the podcast, usually like, oh, is there, anything, we're usually interviewing clinicians, so anything you want to plug, your website and all that. And you mentioned like, I do have stuff that I can mention. So, and I didn't know, and I
Yeah.
was excited to hear about it. So would you mind please telling us about what kind of things you're into besides lecturing at university?
Sure. And as I get into that, just want to say quickly that the other piece about doing nervous system regulation that can make a difference is I am a happier, more connected, more purposeful, more integrated, more joyful person than I have been in my adult life. And so, side effect of nervous system retraining, like it's a pretty good reason to do it.
That's awesome.
Um, so I'm happy to say, as part of this story is that I'm back in my job, and that job is I'm a professor in community development at Acadia University, and my focus is community leadership and creative futures. And you can find me on the Acadia University website. I have a personal website, GabrielleDonnelly.ca. And you can find me on Instagram at Gabrielle Joy Donnelly, where I'm ready to start posting again after years of this chronic illness journey. So yeah, there's lots of places to connect and to find me. And I'm certainly going to stay connected to this kind of thinking and work and sharing this in whatever ways I can. And I'm, I work a lot with leaders in a variety of organizations in big change work. That's been my work before this. That's a whole other story around how that dysregulated my nervous system. But now I'm back in, how do I bring these kinds of tools to everyday leaders and everyday people to help navigate the intensity of living in the 21st century in modern life. So that's an offering that'll be coming up sometime in 2025.
Amazing. Well, I've just made a note. I'm going to add that to the show notes, so the links will be there for folks if they want to check out your offerings, and I will tag you on your Instagram profile so you can share this video when it comes out if you're
Okay,
open to that. And yeah, thanks so much again, Gabrielle. I really appreciate your time today. And yeah, can't thank you enough. So thank you.
my pleasure.
Thanks to everyone listening to this episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. Please stay tuned for the next one.